Welcome to History at the OK Corral. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and share this episode with a fellow history lover. And now, on to tonight's episode. Northern Wyoming, December 21st, 1866. As battle cries and screams of agony ring out all around him, 32-year-old Adolf Metzger is in a desperate fight for his life. Tucked back into the scarcely discernible shelter of a crevice amidst a field of boulders, the young German-born immigrant fights ferociously, swinging his weapon with all of his might as guttural exhortations fly unconsciously from his lips. His attackers, who have all but laid waste to his comrades, are a collection of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapahoe warriors, hundreds strong, fighting under the command of the legendary Red Cloud. They wield bows, arrows, lances, knives, and tomahawks and advance upon their ensconced quarry with the myopic fury of a hungry pride of lions. Metzger, for his part, wields only a small brass instrument, a bugle, that he desperately swings as dozens of lances and arrows berate his position. To a random passerby, this spectacle would doubtless appear curious, if not slightly comical, were it not for the deadly serious consequences of the fight at hand. But, as curious as the sight might be, it is anything but a random encounter. Adolf Metzger is a soldier in the United States Army, serving in the 2nd Cavalry Regiment, C Company. At 5 feet 8 inches tall, with brown hair and blue eyes, he cuts a similar figure to many of his comrades who now lie cold in death around his position. He serves as the company bugler, a critical position in a time before radio communication. Metzger's job is to belt out the appropriate tunes on the bugle to denote attacks, retreats, and various maneuvers. The U.S. Army has determined that buglers need both hands free in order to properly execute their duties, and thus, the only weapon that Metzger has left is the diminutive brass instrument, with which he now makes a desperate last stand. Though he now stands here incurring the consequences of the United States government's repeated offenses against the Northern Plains nations, Metzger is but a poor soldier, at the mercy of his commanders and his duty. 6 months earlier, in June of 1866, the 2nd Cavalry, under the command of Colonel Henry B. Carrington, had ridden out of Fort Laramie in what is today southeastern Wyoming and into what is known as the Powder River Country with orders to protect immigrants traveling on the Bozeman Trail. A treaty had been agreed to with most of the powerful Northern Plains nations in 1851, including the Cheyenne, Lakota, Arapahoe, Assiniboine, Mandan, Hidatsa, and Crow tribes. Signed in the very fort Carrington had ridden out of, it is known as the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851. The treaty had designated this area in the Powder River Country as belonging to the Crow tribe, and guaranteed it immunity from incursion by either rival tribes or American settlers. However, a decade and a half of dwindling buffalo herds and increasing encroachment from westbound immigrants has driven the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapahoe into more and more desperate straits. Fed up with the lack of trustworthiness exhibited by the United States government, the mighty Red Cloud has gathered a formidable army of highly motivated warriors intent not only on forestalling westward expansion, but on eliminating every soldier, settler, and rival tribe from their territory for good. While many of the soldiers now serving in the post-Civil War Army are indeed accustomed to combat and the hardships of life on the trail, none of them, nor their superiors, have seen anything like the warfare being waged upon them by Red Cloud. For the next few months, after their arrival in the Powder River Country, as they labored and constructed the fort that would be their home, the soldiers dealt with incessant attacks from warriors riding under the command of Red Cloud. Even after the fort was completed, Colonel Carrington was reticent to send any patrols outside of its walls in order to engage and deter the constant onslaught of piecemeal attacks. As the casualties mounted and the frustration amongst the ranks grew, Carrington's subordinate officers, most notably Captain William Fetterman, began to insist more and more vociferously that the only way to stop the attacks was to take the fight to Red Cloud and his warriors. Carrington and Fetterman had both served in the Union Army during the Civil War, though both men had had wildly different experiences throughout the conflict. While both had served honorably, Carrington, a Yale-educated officer and highly regarded as a masterful bureaucrat, had not seen combat on the front lines. Instead, he had solidified his reputation as a tireless organizer and, by war's end, had become head of a Union spy ring being run out of Indianapolis. Carrington, as well as his superiors, saw this excursion into the Powder River country as an opportunity to garner the 42-year-old a measure of actual combat experience and pad his otherwise exemplary record. Whether due to his disposition, inexperience, or simply differing discernment of the situation at hand, Carrington had repeatedly denied his officers permission to pursue the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapahoe. By December of 1866, this had caused an increasing level of discontent amongst nearly everyone ensconced within the timber confines of the fort. While no major engagements had taken place, it seemed to the inhabitants of the fort that one or two of them were turning up dead with alarming regularity. Among the most vocal proponents of taking up a more offensive course of action against the native attackers is Captain Fetterman. In stark contrast to his superior officer, Captain Fetterman has seen frontline action in the Civil War. He had participated in the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain, as well as Sherman's March. After the conclusion of the Civil War, Fetterman had stayed in the U.S. Army with the intentions of becoming a career officer. Though Fetterman's father had served as an officer in the Army, he had been orphaned as a young man and in his late teens denied entrance into West Point. Though he had gone on to assemble an impressive military resume, the combined lack of both a familial and educational pedigree imbued the captain with a burning sense of ambition. Though it was not an uncommon exhortation amongst American officers on the plains, Fetterman had repeatedly claimed that with a force of 80 men, he could wipe out the entire Sioux nation. Finally, after being ordered by General George Cooke to take the offensive against the murderous and insulting attacks, Carrington began to take a more aggressive approach against Red Cloud and his warriors. On December 6th, Carrington received word that a wagon train of woodcutters was under attack. The woodcutters, men whose job of venturing out into the nearby woods to procure timber was quickly becoming one of the most dangerous professions on the frontier, were roughly 4 miles west of the relative safety of the fort walls. Immediately grasping the gravity of the situation, Carrington ordered Fetterman to lead a company of cavalry and a squad of mounted infantry directly to the scene, while he led another attachment north to cut off the retreat of the warriors. Carrington had, in fact, made tactically astute decisions. However, 2 young lieutenants named Grummond and Bingham had led 3 other troops in pursuit of a small group of warriors, only to wind up in an ambush. Grummond and 2 others had managed to escape, narrowly making it back to rejoin their commander with several of Red Cloud's warriors in hot pursuit. Carrington had then found himself and the remainder of his contingent surrounded by roughly 100 warriors. However, with the arrival of Fetterman and his backup, the attacking warriors were compelled to retreat north, disappearing over the rolling hills. As Carrington and his men re-entered the walls of Fort Kearny, it was all too obvious to those of them that had seen combat in the Civil War that this, combat on the open plains, would be an altogether different business. Those who had never experienced combat before this were chilled to the bone by the realization that they were all a very long way from home, with limited support, surrounded by their enemy in their enemy's own land. It must have seemed to many that their saving grace would indeed be their faction's superior technology. While U.S. Army soldiers who had fought the Plains tribes prior to the Civil War had been largely armed with single-shot rifles and early iterations of the Colt revolver, these men were equipped with weapons developed largely over the course of the preceding 6 years. The officers among them generally carried the Model 1860 Colt or 1858 Remington 44 caliber revolvers. The typical infantryman carried the Springfield Model 1863 rifle musket chambered in .58 caliber, while the typical cavalryman was armed with either a Spencer Model 1860 52 caliber or Model 1865 50 caliber 7-shot repeating carbine. The warriors fighting under Red Cloud are largely armed with only their traditional bows, lances, shields, and war clubs, with only a few warriors armed with 44 caliber revolvers and single-shot flintlock rifles. This discrepancy in firepower is, it is now obvious to most, the only thing keeping them alive here in the unforgiving austerity of the snow-laden Powder River country. In their after-action reports, Carrington and Fetterman concurred that the lack of discipline and organization exhibited by the troops during the engagement was indeed cause for great concern. Fetterman commented that this Indian war has become a hand-to-hand fight, requiring the utmost caution. The one man in the fort with significant experience in fighting the tribes of the northern plains was the 62-year-old legendary mountain man, trapper, scout, explorer, and frontiersman Jim Bridger, who served as a lead scout for Carrington. Bridger, who for weeks had observed the increasing difficulties of the young soldiers in dealing with the attacks from the native warriors, remarked to the general that, "Your soldiers don't know anything about fighting Indians." Carrington had immediately redoubled the training of his troops, drilling them incessantly and making abundantly clear to the officers, time and again, that caution must be exercised in all engagements, attacks must be limited, and all maneuvers made in the interest of minimizing their men's exposure to danger. The number of guards on duty was doubled, and all of the 50 remaining horses of the fort were to remain saddled from dawn to dark in case of an immediate need. On December 19th, the drilling and precautions seemed to have paid off when General Carrington had ordered a captain named Powell to assist a group of woodcutters under attack. Following his orders with scrupulous detail, Powell had indeed managed to force the attacking warriors into retreat. He had not allowed any pursuit of the warriors and had returned safely with the woodcutting detail in tow. The following day, Carrington had refused the request of Captain Fetterman and Captain Brown, another veteran officer, to take a contingent of well-armed civilian employees of the fort on a raid to disperse or capture a Lakota village situated roughly 50 miles away on the Tongue River. This almost certainly saved the lives of all the proposed participants, as the village was much larger and much more ready to make war than the captains realized. However, the cavalrymen's respite from the cold of death would be tragically all too brief. It would be only a day later, on December 21st at about 10 a.m., when General Carrington was alerted of a band of warriors yet again harassing a party of woodcutters. The morning had been clear and cold, and while another attack had been expected, most had hoped their advancing from the fort might come in the comparatively warmer hours of the afternoon. By all accounts of those present, Carrington gave Captain Fetterman clear orders not to pursue the warriors over Lodge Trail Ridge that lay to the north of the fort. He was only to proceed northwest, reinforce the security detail accompanying the woodcutting party, and return. Under no circumstances, Carrington ordered, are you to pursue over the ridge to the north. Captain Fetterman departed the fort not long after 10 a.m. Captain Brown, soon to receive orders to leave the fort and loath to pass up one last opportunity at avenging his fallen countrymen, volunteered to go as well. Issuing the call to advance outside the gates had been Adolph Metzger, whose steady intonations hid a growing unease rapidly taking hold of his nerves. Marching forward under the directives of Metzger's bugle is the largest relief force yet sent out by Carrington, including a detachment of infantrymen on foot. Leading a small detachment of cavalry assigned to support these men on their way to the battlefield is Lieutenant George Drummond, who only days earlier had narrowly escaped death by impetuously pursuing a party of warriors into the ambush that had killed Lieutenant Bingham and another soldier. As the gates to the fort closed, Carrington retreated to his quarters, by all accounts relatively confident in Fetterman's fidelity to his orders, but concerned about the discipline of Lieutenant Bingham, considering his actions on the previous few days. However, with limited men and limited time, he still felt that Bingham was more of an asset than a liability. However, within the hour, before 11 a.m., Carrington would be alerted that Fetterman had, despite his explicit orders, pursued the party of attacking warriors to the north. Within the confines of the fort, the situation is maddeningly inexplicable to the general. Later accounts of the battle from Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapahoe sources shed light on what might have provoked an attack that should have been explicitly prohibited under direct order. Among the warriors attacking the wagon train on this icy northern plains morning is a young warrior with oddly light skin and wavy hair. He had been spotted before by the soldiers and woodcutters alike, standing out not only for his appearance, but his unyielding ferocity. Again and again, when other warriors had retreated, or worse yet, fallen in death, the young man had proven indefatigable in assaulting his enemy. His own people, too, were increasingly impressed with his bravery and selflessness. Though still in his early 20s, the young man was beginning to cultivate a reputation as a fearless warrior and trustworthy leader. As a child, because of his hair, he had been known as Curly. Now, he is known amongst his people as Tisonka Whitco, or Crazy Horse. Crazy Horse and company, upon seeing the arrival of Captain Fetterman and his men, see yet another opportunity to employ one of their favorite tactics, a feigned retreat. In hopes of drawing the army officer's ire and enticing him to follow their feigned retreat into an ambush, Crazy Horse hurls repeated insults at Fetterman and his men, cursing them in English and striking threatening poses as a challenge. Finally, in either desperation or disgust, Crazy Horse had turned his back to the soldiers, dropped his leather leggings, and mooned them. Whether or not this insult is indeed the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back, Fetterman's men did indeed give chase. One possibility later proffered by researchers is that it was in fact Grumman, again at the mercy of his own vainglorious impulses, who broke ranks and began to lead the charge. As the pursuit carried on northward, Grumman and the bulk of the force pulled ahead of Fetterman, Brown, and the remainder of the force by several hundred yards. As they proceeded over the crest of Lodge Trail Ridge, however, they are met with what must have been a sickeningly bone-chilling sight. Thousands of warriors stood ready to meet them. The attack was not sprung until Grumman and his party were near the bottom of the ridge, with Fetterman and Brown between them and the fort. At first, an attempt to stand their ground is made. Then, quickly seeing the futility of this approach, Grumman, leading the contingent of troops furthest down the hill, begins to lead a fighting retreat up the steep slope, intending to reunite with Fetterman. Now, as the battle rages on, the attacking Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapahoe have managed to separate the two forces further. Though he fights valiantly and attempts to lead the men who have followed him back up the hill, Grumman is soon cut down in vicious hand-to-hand combat. As the infantry desperately slip and slide as they attempt to climb their way up the hill, they too are cut down in brutal fashion by arrows, clubs, and spears. Soon, the white snow of the hillside is stained in large swatches of blood and viscera. Fetterman and Brown lead the men still alive under their command to an outcropping of boulders, from where they presumably intend to hold out until reinforcements arrive. They squeeze off round after round, desperately trying to issue orders over the din of rifle fire, war cries, and the screams of the wounded and dying. It is mere minutes, however, before Captain Fetterman is cut down by a hulking Sioux warrior named American Horse, with a devastating blow from his nail-studded war club, after which the warrior leaps from his horse and cuts the American's throat. The outcropping is overrun in short order, with troopers falling all around in their final throes of agony as they are brutalized by attacking warriors. Knowing the fate that now awaits him, Captain Brown fires off every remaining round in his revolver, saving the last for himself. Before he can be overtaken and subjected to the torturous demise of his comrades, Captain Brown falls dead by his own hand. Among the last left alive is Adolf Metzger, who now knows he has but moments left to live. As the hellish reality unfolds around him, perhaps his mind indeed recalls a brief synopsis of his life. Scenes he will never see again. The German countryside of his youth, the countless charges he had survived during the previous few years, and doubtless recollections of his worried mother and beloved, long-suffering wife, Frederica, whom he had married while still on campaign in the summer of 1864. This respite, though, must last only moments. As Metzger continues to swing his instrument, the bugle incurring dents as his body incurs slashes and stab wounds. He backs further into the crevice, now with no room left to retreat. The scene over the next few minutes is one of unabated brutality, as Metzger too is slashed, cut, and bludgeoned until he finally falls dead on the cold Wyoming ground. The last American soldier left alive during this engagement, one that will come to be known as the Fetterman Massacre, or Fetterman's Fight, is now gone. To the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapahoe warriors, the success of their tactics is inarguable. Before this battle, a Sioux medicine man had reported having a dream, in which he had held 100 dead blue-coat soldiers in each hand. In the lore of the Sioux, the battle is known as the Battle of the 100 in the Hand. This engagement would be the most costly ever inflicted upon the U.S. Army until a full decade later, when many of the same warriors would decimate Custer's forces at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. For Red Cloud, the utter devastation wrought upon the U.S. Army in this engagement is but a pretense of things to come. The Battle of the 100 in the Hand is but one engagement in what will come to be known as Red Cloud's War, the most successful military campaign ever led by native forces against the United States Army. But the epic tale of how the mighty Sioux chief managed to bring to bear the power of his leadership and his people's resolve in one of the greatest military campaigns in the history of the Old West, as well as the story of how General Carrington responded to the tragic massacre of his men, are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Thank you for joining us on this episode of History at the OK Corral. Be sure to click the like button, share this episode with a friend, and become a subscriber. And if you'd like to support our work and gain early access to episodes, as well as ad-free viewing, you can become a member of this channel by clicking the join button or click the link in the description below to become a member on Patreon. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.